Hello, One Thing community. This is Jay Papasan, your host today. I'm the co author of the book, and today I get the privilege of talking to Nikki Miller. You know Nikki Miller. She's been the primary podcast host for the last 70 plus episodes of this podcast. You've heard her talk to all kinds of legends in their industry about their books and how they live the one thing. And today we get to unpack the lessons she's learned in the last year and a half working in this organization. And we'll break it down into kind of three conversations. Her one thing throughout that 18 months was really to drive the podcast, to show up every week and create a high quality listen for you. That's why you're here, right? And all the things that she had to do to make that happen, the lessons that she learned, we break it down into four about what it means to live your one thing, especially during times of great change. I also asked her about what it meant to live the one thing so publicly as an ambassador for the brand and got some great ahas for her. And maybe my favorite part is towards the end, where we talk about the lessons she learned from interacting with our One Thing community. We have a community of about 4,000 people that come together and they're striving to live the one thing in a world that doesn't always honor focus on one thing. And there was some great takeaways from that, her observations, my own, on what it means to have a community around you that supports your approach to life, living your values, saying no to things that don't matter and saying yes to what does. I hope you enjoy this podcast as much as I do. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Nikki Miller. All right, Nikki, this is super fun. We get to kind of unpack a lot of what you've learned in the last year and a half. And I'm super curious, right? We get to work together, but you don't always get to step back and ask someone, what are you seeing and how we're working together, and then have it be an open discussion and one that's recorded for the public, right? So who knows what comes out of this. But we were kicking around like three kind of lenses. For the last 18 months, you've come in to help us with marketing and growth. Your core job was running this podcast, which you did for 75 episodes or so. So I'd love it if you would kind of, let's unpack what are the lessons you learned from doing your one thing for your job, like the day in and day out of hosting a top podcast and making sure that it gets done, living the one thing, but in a much more public setting. I know that you lived it before you joined our organization, but it's different when you're going on stages representing that organization, right? The standard gets a little higher. I'd like to unpack that, what that feels like. And then you also have gotten to experience our One Thing community, right? It's more than 4,000 strong, and they come together at our events and what you've observed there. Does that seem like a good game plan to you?
Let's do it.
Well, let's start with the kind of the one thing, right? You had to, or you got to host this podcast for 70, 75 episodes. In the beginning, it was really a big part of your day-to-day was working on it. But during this journey, you sold your business, which means you had to transfer from being an entrepreneur to being an asset for the business that acquired you. I don't know if that meant you're technically an employee or not, but that was a big role change for you. Lots and lots of change. And like that same week, you found out you're having another child. So, but let's juggle some balls.
As life goes, Jay.
Let's juggle some balls. But we know with the one thing, it's all about, can you show up, identify your priority, and execute on it? And it's not maybe always like that you killed it in the gym that day, but some days you just show up. Walk me through some of that journey.
Well, I think you said it best, Jay. I think I've learned so incredibly much about how to implement the one thing at a much higher level, because conceptually, being around it as long as I have, inside Keller Williams, then inside the one thing, conceptually, I thought I knew what it meant to focus on the one thing. And until you are surrounded by mass chaos and change, you don't really understand what it means to focus on the one thing. And I would offer that in the most challenging times, and whether challenge means that it's an actual hard time or just a chaotic time, because that brings its own set of challenges, or a time of high change, that's when the one thing becomes the most important thing. Because there are a ton of things in that space that you could do. And asking yourself the focusing question and forcing myself to actually utilize these incredible tools in my day-to-day, forcing myself to actually utilize these things, I was able to bear it down to what actually has to happen in all of this chaos and all the things that could take my attention and all the things that could take my energy. What do I absolutely need to do or focus on such that by doing it, it makes everything else easier or unnecessary? And so in this time, I don't know that I would have been able to manage it had I not had the skill set of the one thing that I do now after being able to use it at a much higher level, being inside this organization.
I heard two great things. You talked about navigating this big changes in your life. And I've been through it, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners, like you feel like you're in a great rhythm, and then life happens, and all of your systems seem to break, not one at a time, but all at once. So that's a big one. I want to hit that. But you also started, like, you'd never hosted a podcast before this, right? You'd been on them, but you'd never had the job of sitting in the chair as the principal host. I know, because we talked about it, coaching and some other things. Walk us through how you prepared, because I know that you want to show up, give 100%, and really nail it. What can you think back? How did you prepare for that opportunity so that when you did get in front of the microphone, you felt confident and ready to go?
Well, I think the most important thing is that you actually do prepare. I think sometimes we go into our days, which is also a one thing principle. And so often we go into our days completely unprepared. We haven't really had any forethought about how we're going to show up today. What are we going to do such that by doing it puts us in line of knocking over the right dominoes? And so I just practice the same thing in the podcast. What can I do such that by doing it is going to make this the best interview possible, not only for our listeners, but for the person who's on the other side? And that usually meant if we're talking about a book, then I need to actually read the book. So
Yeah.
I've read more books in the last year, 18 months than I've read in my entire life. And it's been incredible because I wanted to make sure that I was showing up authentically, could actually ask great questions about what it is that I was learning on the podcast too. And then being a genuine student. I think so often when we're interviewing people who are on a lot of podcasts, they get into sort of these talk tracks, right? The same thing would happen for you or me if somebody asked us for some advice on the one thing, because we talk about it all the time.
Right.
And so I can get into a talk track really easily on it. And so I focused in the podcast on asking great questions that maybe took us outside the person's talk track, but really focused on how they implemented the work that they do. Because I think that's the thing that's often missed. I didn't want to know about theory. I wanted to know, how do we actually use this? Because that's, again, a one thing principle wherein knowledge is great, but if we can't do anything with it, then it doesn't really matter. So I prepared by actually being a student and then asking myself, okay, this is all great in theory, but how do I use it? What do I do with it? And that's where I tried to take the majority of our interviews. Tell me how to use this in real life and day to day.
You also got, was it a speaking coach or a podcast host or both? You actually hired someone to bring their expertise and teach you models. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Because if you want to really send yourself down a rabbit hole, just listen to yourself talk or watch videos of yourself, and
Oh,
you
it's
will realize
horrible.
all of the horrible tics that you have are all of the extra words that you use, the stutters that you have. And I realized early on in the podcast that if I wanted to grow as quickly as I wanted to go, in order for this to be what I wanted it to be for our audience, that I was going to need to level up my game quickly. And there's no faster way to do that than to get a great coach.
Love that. So, one other thing that I know that you did, because I got to co host some podcasts, beyond reading someone's book, you would also do a deep dive. You would have your team pull together, like you do also research the author or the entrepreneur and have, like, so you read the book, you researched the entrepreneur before you prepared your questions. Just out of curiosity, you read all these books. What's the standout book? What's one book that stands out to you as something that you learned a lot from?
Ooh.
I didn't ask you to prepare for this one.
No, that's such a hard question. It's like picking your favorite kid.
I know, but what was the first book that came to mind?
I was going to say it wasn't the first book that came to mind, but it was the first interview. So I'll cheat
Sure.
and I'll say that connected to a book was Super Communicators with Charles Duhigg. And here's
Oh,
why. I'll give the why. I respect so much, and I know we're going to talk about this, and this is something I learned too, but I respect so much those that live what they talk about, because you know a lot of authors, I now know a lot of authors, and there are so many that theorize and have never actually implemented or talk a lot about a thing, but when you meet them, maybe that thing doesn't show up in how they show up. And he was just the embodiment of what it is that he wrote about in his book. And I have never felt so comfortable and open and happy after a conversation than I did after that one. And it was just such a beautiful example of someone who absolutely lives their one thing.
I love that. We'll link to that in the show notes and to the book. Duhigg, I want to say Charles, since we talked to him for like an hour. Chuck.
Charles.
Yeah. He wrote The Power of Habit. And I shared on that episode how I had to embargo that book for fear that we would plagiarize something, right? But it was such a pleasure after reading binders and binders of research on habits to go into his research and know that we got a lot of it right. Because that's one brilliant journalist, and a Pulitzer Prize winning one, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
That's a great. I was wondering if you were going to do Worthy, because I know that was another one, Jamie Kern Lima, that you were very excited about early on.
Yes, a very close second. I also have been a longtime student. We had James Doty on the podcast, who is a neuroscientist who specializes in the actual science of manifestation. And I remember 10 years ago, I read his book and remember thinking to myself, I'd love to meet this guy one day. And here we were on a podcast together. So there's been a lot of really cool moments, but I would say the standout of an example of living your one thing absolutely had to be Charles.
Yeah, that was a delight for me as well. And it was such a fun and informative conversation. And you could see him role modeling the book while we were doing it. So he's very concentric. When Gary showed me the essay, The Power of One, that became The One Thing, we were talking about whether it was a book or not. And I was putting my publisher's hat on from being at HarperCollins. And I was like, think about everything that you've done. Like, what we're talking about here is the essence of your success. And it's very rare when an author, like a lot of times they have a great idea that they have unique perspective on, but to get the extra bonus of it also explains a lot of their own success is a really unique kind of trifecta.
Yeah.
You had a coach, you prepared great questions, you researched the guests, you read the books themselves, which is a big time commitment. How much time did you have to block on a weekly basis to make this happen?
It's interesting. I don't remember the exact number. You probably would know it better than me. But before you do a speaking engagement, they say there's a certain number of hours that you should prepare per the number of hours or minutes that you're going to be speaking. And it's interesting in this space. And I had long time had the privilege and opportunity to get to speak on stages and teach classes. But I found myself preparing far more for this, wherein I'm actually not talking as much, or shouldn't be if I'm doing it right. And wherein a 1 hour speech might take me at this stage 2 hours to prepare for, probably at most, unless it was something completely brand new. I was probably spending at least 5 to 8 hours, depending upon what it was and the book or who the person was.
Reading a book can take 6 to 8 hours just by itself.
Yeah, exactly. So if I had the opportunity to actually read it cover to cover, which you don't always, but if I had the opportunity and got it early enough to read it cover to cover, I would say at least on average about 5 to 8 hours per guest and episode. So it's 5 to 8 hours for 30 to 45 minutes of an actual episode.
I mean, that's a great lesson. I've heard all kinds of stories about Joe Montana throwing 1,000 passes in practice for every one he threw on the football field during a live game, and how like so many people look up and say, you made that look easy. And what they miss is the hard work that goes on behind the scenes.
Yeah.
I don't know that there's a rule of thumb. I've told you what I've found is for every hour I'm on stage, if I prepare for 4, all of my nerves and jitters go away and I feel confident and I feel like I've done enough of a deep dive that I can go wherever I need to go. So that's my personal ratio that I've talked about on the One Thing podcast before. So, all right, thank you for going back to the beginning. It's hard for experts sometimes to remember what is it like if someone's listening to this and think I'm going to start a podcast. I mean, I just got 4 great points that they should do, especially if they're going to interview people. Now, you also navigated change. Like in a 1 month period, really 2 weeks, you navigated the sale of a business that you built from the ground up into a huge success, got acquired. You got your quote exit, which is congratulations again.
Thank you.
And that same time you found out you were pregnant with a second child. Now you had to continue doing what you were doing through that. What were some of the challenges and how did you address them?
I'm trying to think where to even begin, Jay, or how I can one thing these challenges. I wouldn't say so much as that they were challenges by way of I've always had, and I think this is a commonality that I see with people who are successful. I've always had a great head on my shoulders around what I signed up for. And what I mean by that is that I knew when I was transferring that company, I knew when I made the decision to sell it, I knew when I made the decision to take on all of these things, I knew what I signed up for. So I don't spend a whole lot of time in overwhelm or feeling sorry for myself or looking at challenges as anything negative, because I know what I signed up for. That said, when you navigate that much change at once, it becomes even more challenging to know what you are supposed to do or how to show up as your best self. And it also, from a leadership perspective, is even more challenging to keep your team focused,
Oh, that's a
because
great ad because it wasn't just you. You had to
it's
navigate your
not just
team through
me.
this. Yes.
Yeah, so it's navigating a whole team into a new company, into a similar business model but changed a bit, and the only way to do that is to use the one thing at its highest level. And I was grateful because inside the one thing we had gone through a lot of change, and it's my constant reminder that
You were a part of that change, right? You
yes.
were a part of that change.
Yeah, and I got to learn from you and see you in real time use these principles that I had always sort of set in stone. Meaning that when we build a GPS, a 135, when we build a 411, that it had to be a certain way. And you reminded me that these tools and these models are exactly that. They're models and tools in order for you to use to get to where you need to go and where you want to go, but they're not set in stone. You can make a GPS, which is typically created for a year. You can condense that down to a month if you need to, or 3 months if you need to, or half a year if you need to. You are intended to use the tools. The tools don't use you. And so I had a lot of clarity in being able to use these tools to navigate what was a very chaotic time, not only for me, but also obviously for transferring a team over as well. And I would also say that the one thing helps you to realize that life never stops happening. So this happened to be a moment of time that was mass chaos and a lot of change at once. But I think we are tempted often as people to say, I'll do the thing when life slows down, or when these things calm down, or when this weather is perfect, whatever it might be. But that never happens. That's the
Yeah.
exception, not the rule. And so we have to figure out how to navigate and show up and do the right thing today, no matter what type of chaos is happening, because the chaos never stops happening. And sure, we have times of more chaos or times of less. But I found that in this period, the change was fairly constant. And so whether it was self-created or not, the change was consistent, whether it's market changes, economic changes, changes in rules, whatever it may be, the change was just constant. And so you have to get comfortable figuring out how to show up with the information that you have and the constants that you do know, and still do the right thing headed towards the big goal that you have, and to also be nimble enough to pivot when it's appropriate.
Well, I'd love it if some point you dug up like the GPS you did for the transition. That's like a perfect example of something that's big, but not time based around a year.
Yeah.
In reality, like that kind of transition, y'all had to navigate that probably in 45 days or something. Like, what would have been like, what were the expectations set to kind of get everything moved over? Did you even have 45 days or was it longer?
No, it was much less. It was literally about 2 weeks that
Yeah.
we transferred the whole thing over and launched. And normally in a business transition, you wouldn't do it that quickly, but that's what the market dictated, and that was the direction that we decided to go. And by the way, if I could go back, there were positives and negatives to doing it that way. There is an element of speed in business, which is very helpful. I will fail faster and learn more than someone who spent far more time building the perfect plan. So there's an element that
There's
makes,
something that people lose. Like, yes, you fail faster, and there's a little bit of a cult around that. But because you're
yes,
moving so fast, you also fail more frequently. And that is not always necessary. I know that there's a certain amount of failure that gets baked into learning what you need to learn in order to be ultimately successful. Also, if you move too fast, there can be unnecessary failures that just represent pain that you could have avoided. So, like,
without a doubt.
good luck finding the balance, right?
But
This is like,
yes.
yeah,
And hindsight, you always can see perfectly. And I can see where going so fast hurt us in some places. And in some places it was a benefit to your point, right? I don't know that there's a right quote unquote way,
yeah.
unless you can look backwards and say this was the right way if I could have done it differently.
So 2 weeks, like, so, but like I can see, I mean, I would have done it for myself. I would have coached someone to do it for themselves. Like the whole idea of a GPS is, can you get everybody on one page? And can you force yourself to prioritize such that all of your priorities fit on one page. It's
Right.
really easy to do the laundry list. Here are all the things that have to happen. But in order to really do the one thing, you have to say, what's the success list hidden in this pile of to dos? And that becomes your GPS, your goal. 2 weeks, we integrate. What are the 3 priorities or 4 priorities to make that happen? And on a team, now you can say, John, you're in charge of priority 1. Susie, you're in charge of priority number 2. Like, you can now start assigning who owns the priority and by when it needs to get done. And now you have this handy piece of paper that anybody can see. It's not complicated. What's underneath it can be. But I love the idea of using the tools around something like that, because most people think it has to be a year-long goal. No, it
Yep.
could be a marathon. It could be a team transition. It can be something big and complicated that you need to simplify. And frankly, that requires ruthless prioritization, which is what you need during these times of change.
Yep, absolutely. Well, and it was a great lesson in how important it is to get everybody on the same page, because we brought in an organization that had a lot of commonality and language around the one thing, because we use it, right? That we
Yeah.
actually use these things that we learn, into an organization that maybe didn't have the same commonality or didn't have the same practices. And so there's also an element, I'm sure there's many listeners who are in our community and then are going to new companies or new organizations or bringing in new employees who they have to teach these concepts to. And at first you'll feel resistance to it, because it feels like, well, it can't be that simple, or we can't only do one thing, or I don't like that way of prioritization. It's different than how we've always done it. And so, like I said, it was an incredible leadership lesson in transitioning company and transitioning culture and transitioning approach, action, all of those things. And I can say I have learned more in this short period of time than ever in my entire career.
I had a friend that was on the mergers and acquisitions team at Google, and he shared that culture was always the gotcha, right? That you could merge technology systems,
Yeah.
you could take checklists and combine them, you can do all the things, you can sort through the people that stay, and unfortunately some that go, and then the consolidation. But the culture was always the sticky wicket. Not to reveal anything, but like, how did y'all navigate that? Because surely there was like some difference in the culture. You're both lead gen type companies. So, like, was there anything that you learned in that transition?
I learned that you're absolutely right. That's the gotcha. And I also learned that no one spends any time on it.
Huh.
So we spent so much time prepping to transition the business, to transition the product, to transition the agents, to transition the services, to transition the technology. So much time, effort, and thought went into all of that. And I can very authentically say my greatest mistake was not an ounce of time and energy went into what it would look like to transition the culture.
Well, let's use our time machine and go back in time. Nikki, you could go all the way back. This was in March, because you called to share the news with me, and I was in Spain. I was there speaking, and I was literally talking to you in an airport, walking, going, "Wow, congratulations!" You could go back and give yourself, the leader Nikki, advice. You're about to go through this transition. What would be the one thing you would tell that Nikki to do differently in order to maybe preserve the culture or make the culture easier?
I would have told her, on the culture side, I would have told her to spend time on it, to spend the same amount of time and effort making a plan to transition culture and to understand culture,
Yeah.
just like I did the business.
I love that. I mean, you hinted at some of the things. Like, one of the hallmarks of a culture is the language you use.
Yes.
And like, we've both kind of grown up in the Keller Williams organization, and like, we've got acronyms for every dang thing, right? GPS, 411, you name it, Y4C2Ts. We could just go on and on. If organizations don't have the same language, you also have to just translate. Like, we
Yes.
have this culture statement, you have this. How do we bridge the gaps? So, all right, thank you for letting me go down that little bunny trail. But that felt like a big business lesson for our entrepreneur audience. All right, so we talked a little bit about kind of your primary role for this 18 period, even though you did have other roles, was as the podcast primary host and making sure the show happened week in and week out for 70 plus weeks. You also were already living the one thing. You now had to live the one thing in a very public way, right? People like, oh, you're the host of the podcast. You're on big stages at our events. You're out there as an ambassador of the brand. what did you learn in regards to living your one thing, or just new tricks on how to do it, as being a part of this organization and a leader in it?
Well, I have to give both you and Gary credit getting the incredible privilege of learning from both of you, that you both are living examples of everything that you teach. And so my goal and my hope was to just also exemplify what you both have taught me, which was to be a living example of all the things that you teach. And I think the only way to do that is obviously to actually live it. And so to me, there wasn't any pressure or change other than I had to be very cognizant, which I tried to be anyway, but specifically with these principles, had to be very cognizant as a representative and ambassador to the brand and to you and people that I care about and have learned so much from, and to be able to show up in my day to day, whether it was in a sideline conversation at an event or on a stage or on a podcast, and actually live everything that we talk about, and not to do it perfectly, because I think that that's
Yeah.
something I put some pressure on myself to do at the beginning. And in spending so much time with you and spending time in this organization and spending time really using these principles, I think the thing I've learned most is exactly what we talked about before, that these models and tools are intended to actually be used, and they're not theoretical, which means sometimes you're going to use them imperfectly. That means
Yeah.
sometimes you're going to get it wrong, and sometimes you're going to have to restart, or sometimes you're going to have to change the plan. And learning to do that publicly was a real privilege and very humbling and a real growth opportunity for me. And so I would say the number one thing I focused on was just really being an authentic ambassador to the brand, and actually being someone who lived these principles and used them not only in business but also in life, and to be an example of the things that we talk about.
Well, that's a great one to unpack right there. I know that I've been in and out of this, but there's this false belief out there that in order to lead people in an approach, whether be the one thing approach or something else, that we have to be the best practitioner of it. And in my experience, people, they just want to know that you're being authentic to what you ask them to do, right? If you're asking them to keep a 411 and to prioritize daily, are you trying, honestly trying? I actually think people underestimate how inspiring it can be for the leader to be transparent in their failures and to show, like, yeah, I tried today and I fell short, and tomorrow I'll do better, because that's the reality, right? Nobody is perfectly doing this, not Gary, not me, not anyone I've ever met. It's not super complicated, but we know it's not easy, because life comes at you fast, and learning and having the discipline to stop and ask, what's the priority here? What is the one thing here? What should I be embodying in this moment? Should I be focused on my family or my work? Like, asking those questions in the moment is tough, and we don't always do it well. So I love that you shared that. I also had people, maybe it's because I'm the author, that would delight in pointing out when I was multitasking publicly. And I'd be like, okay, give me a break, man. I'm not
A
multitasking while
human
I'm doing my
being.
one thing. Yeah, come on. Anything else to unpack around that? Just the journey of living your one thing as the host?
Like I said, I think it was a great example that the path to authenticity is a very real and true path. In other words, exactly what you said, to live the things that you talk about. I mean, the one thing has been an incredible example of what it means to live your values out loud, and to live your values on purpose, and to show up authentically by way of just doing the things that you tell other people to do. And that was a great reminder for me to stay true to my values, and also to stay true to what it is that I'm training, and what it is that I'm telling other people to do in order to get to where they want to go, and to do it with some humility and patience with yourself along the way.
And humor, which I
Yeah,
know that you do
totally.
as well. Totally. So, all right, then the last category, we talked about you and the primary role. Your one thing was the podcast, kind of, and living the one thing as an ambassador. I also felt like you got to see our one thing community, or as Kaylin sometimes calls them, our one thing family, 4,000 plus strong in our community group, and how we support and teach each other. You got to be on stage. You did a keynote at our goal setting retreat last year. What are some of your observations as someone who was outside and got to be inside? on what it means to have a community of people living the one thing around you.
I think it was such a beautiful example of what happens when you have people who have common language and who have a common vision for their life. And not to say that everyone who is in that community has the same goals. Obviously, there's people who do all different things, people who are entrepreneurs, intrapreneurs, people who use the one thing for their family, for their health goals, whatever it is. But it's a community of people who use the same principles and speak the same language. And it was a constant reminder for me how important it is to have that around you in order to be able to stay on track. And I think that people continue to stay connected to our community because they are, like I said, surrounded by people who can use the same language, who are battling the same battles, who have the same skill set and tool set. Wherein when you bring this ideology somewhere where it's unfamiliar, it can be hard to respect your one thing or teach people to respect your one thing or to utilize the one thing if you're trying to force it upon a group of people who have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes this community so incredibly strong and also incredibly supportive because they all realize exactly what we've been talking about today, which is that the one thing is a set of tools to be used consistently and constantly. It's not a plan that you make and then set it on your desk and forget it. It's something you have to come back to every single day, and that you especially come back to when times are challenging or when life gets challenging or when chaos happens, which it inevitably does. And so it's a great community of people who support each other in continuing to come back to this set of tools.
We wrote about in the book, one of the four thieves, right, is when you don't have a productivity specific environment.
Right.
And that can be the literal physical environment you're in, right? Too many distractions. Like, I'm not going to try to write a novel in a video arcade. Probably not going to work out for me. But you also, more importantly, the people you surround yourself with. And if I go back in time, when we first launched the community, one of the things that we identified that we needed to provide was a place where people could find support in truly pursuing their one thing, a culture that honored no's, that encouraged people to honor their time blocks, because most of us don't have that at home. I pointed out to Jeff, my co-founders, like, we're walking around in Keller Williams where this stuff was born and not perfected, but people were truly trying to. So we take it for granted that people say, I can't do it then, but I could do it now. Whereas other people feel like they're letting people down when they create some boundaries around their life. And so we wanted to create a safe space for people to find the support they may not have at home, they may not get from their boss, they may not find at work at all, maybe their school environment, where they could be testing these principles with support, right? And people saying, yes, it's okay to do that. It's okay to say no. And the response has been that that's one of their number one things. They just want to see other people striving towards the same things and know that they're not alone.
Absolutely. And I think that's exactly what you see when you get in this community, whether it's in our Facebook group, whether it's at a live event, whether it's just at a meetup, which happen all the time, a group of people who say, I want to be around other people who know this language and who are using these principles on a day-to-day basis.
Well, we're going to wrap this up now. Thank you so much for sharing your observations. I'm always super curious to hear what a smart wickedly business smart person like yourself can learn in such a short period of time. One, I want to also publicly thank you for stepping in and joining our team. You've given us some good books, by the way, the fun stuff, not all the business. We've changed the culture in the company for a lot more fun. And we made some great strides forward during this great transition. So thank you for stepping in. I hope you got as many gifts as we did from being in business with you. And now your one thing is about to change, right? You've got your current role that you need to work through, whatever timeline that's on. You got a big role, the mama hat, that's about to get on big time. And so we're really excited for you and wish the luck. And we hope that you'll come back on the other side of all of this.
And Jay, I would also like to publicly thank you for the privilege of a lifetime, which has been getting to be on this podcast, getting to be in partnership with you, in partnership with The One Thing, getting to be a part of this incredible organization and community. It's been the absolute privilege of a lifetime, and I'm so grateful.
Well, the feeling's mutual, Nikki. Thank you. And thank you, listeners, for joining us and learning from Nikki on her journey. And for now, I'll just say thank you to all of you. See you next week, folks.